Hello and welcome to another episode of the BeamG podcast. We've mentioned it a couple of times before, this tricky business of meaning. Well, let's delve more deeply into what that actually is and how to achieve meaning in stories. So basically, the meaning of meaning. What does meaning mean? When is a tale meaningful? Before we get into the main focus of this podcast series, characters and plot and a few other things, here are a few perspectives on imbuing your plot and characters with a subtext. Meaning is that which is intended or understood. The audience draws significance or relevance or profundity out of a story when it understands the deeper implications and reasonings and causes behind it. The meaning of a story depends on the standpoint of the storyteller or of the recipient. An author may mean something different from what the audience understands. So let's try to unravel this tricky but essential element of stories, meaning. It's one of the elements that we noted before that stories cannot help but exhibit. Characters, plot, language, otherwise known as style or voice, meaning, but we also mentioned backstory, story world, exposition, perhaps even conflict. The interplay of characters and their actions form the plot, and all this is brought into a story structure or narrative, which exhibits dramaturgy. Since there is mostly an author writing the novel, or a team of people making the film, their stylistic choices determine the language of the work. How might we then look for the meaning of a story? Well, meaning is, of course, a very broad term for something hard to pinpoint. Let's start with academic approaches. There are several. For a start, there's the author's intention as one frame of meaning. What was the storyteller trying to tell us? What did the writer mean by choosing exactly those words? What did the director want to get across with these particular images and sounds? How does the author differ from the narrator? And what is the relationship between the narrator and the characters? And how does all that determine what the recipient understands? Then there's the interpretation the recipient brings to bear. How does the reader or viewer understand the story? This can be based purely and solely on the work itself, where only the text of the novel or the interplay of images and sounds of a film is analyzed and interpreted. Another approach is to examine the way a work is understood in a broader context. The meaning the work generates may be influenced by what is known about the author or the culture that the work springs from. What is the reason behind the author's urge to write this story in just such a way? Is the story mimetic of life? How much is made up, and how much is determined by who the author is? Parallels may be drawn to other works. That is to say, a work can be analyzed in the context of the time and place it was produced, and understood in relation to other works and to history. All these are typical academic approaches to stories. While many ways to glean meaning from stories do not make as sharp a distinction between text and content as we might do at BeamG, innovative techniques of telling a story tend to excite professors of literature more than classically crafted tales told in modes that are established. Stories told in such a way that they push the boundary of familiar modes or genres or media tend to be considered more meaningful, at least in the history of a particular media, such as the novel. For example, Ulysses by James Joyce is considered groundbreaking because no author had tried so many writing techniques or styles within one work before. So labels such as literature or art are more quickly bestowed on works that are less accessible because the authors are experimenting with unfamiliar techniques. And once these techniques become familiar, they typically get a name ending in ism, such as postmodernism or magical realism. And once the techniques are used by many authors, or in the mainstream of fiction, will become very popular among audiences, academics no longer consider new works created in such a mode particularly artistic or meaningful. Okay, what about industry approaches? Well, the term meaning also has implications for the publishing or entertainment industries. At Beanji, we consider differentiating between commercial versus literary fiction somewhat spurious. We are not really concerned with labels such as mainstream versus art house. Hopefully, our outlining tool and this podcast will convey that dramaturgy is equally important wherever in any such spectrum a story may be positioned. We do think, however, that typical of the commercial or mainstream end is that the audience is not made to work as hard. Much literary or art house fiction is that because it is less direct, less obvious in meaning. It makes the audience work harder in that it poses more riddles. To reiterate this point, rather than saying everything there is to know about the story or a scene outright, the author may veil what is actually going on, giving hints and pointers rather than spelling things out. Pre-interpretation or direct statements of theme are avoided. Mainstream is easy to consume. Art challenges the audience to understand. As a simple example, here's the opening line of The Sound and the Fury. Through the fence, between the curling flower spaces, I could see them hitting. William Faulkner deliberately chooses not to explicitly tell the audience that what is being described here in the next pages is a game of golf. On the contrary, the word hitting misleads the reader because it connotes and even denotes violence. That it's only about golf is a piece of information that the readers must work out for themselves through other clues given on the first page, such as the words flag and caddy, where caddy, it soon transpires, is also the name of a character. Now, certainly it would have been quicker for the reader to recognize the action being described if Faulkner had used the word golf. However, the opening pages achieve that the audience understands more about what the point of view character Benji sees than he does himself, and learns about Benji's mental state. Now, none of this is directly relayed, it's all in a form of code. The author's choice of words determines meaning. So, art house and literature encodes stories and plot events more than commercial mainstream fiction might. Nonetheless, dramaturgy, the crafting of narrative, is no less relevant for such encoded stories. In novels like Ulysses, or Nabokov's Lolita, or Faulkner's The Sound and the Fury, the structures of the stories themselves, i.e. what the characters do, when and why, are consciously composed rather than left to chance. Then there's the individual approaches. Whenever any individual is sucked into experiencing a story, probably a mixture of all the things that we've mentioned so far takes place. In addition, there are all the personal associations that this individual brings to bear. If you're reading a novel or watching a movie, the arrangement of words in a sentence or the composition of an image might resonate within you or remind you of something, consciously or unconsciously. Your brain will start to make connections which are unique to you, beyond any authorial intention. These associations can be cultural, or they may be utterly personal. It's difficult, if not impossible, to be sure how much of which is at play in any given association. To an American, we may hypothesize, the image of an American flag will awaken somewhat different associations than, for instance, to an inhabitant of Indonesia. This is a cultural aspect. On the other hand, a love story might awaken memories of the one that got away. Or a fight scene might remind you of an altercation you once had at school. And these are totally personal memories. So there are layers of meaning that are specific to each member of the audience, and that are pretty much beyond the control of the author. Note, however, that such layers of meaning seem to be evoked by the story in each recipient through the emotions they feel. So meaning is not necessarily as rational as we might think. Meaning in narrative. We do not suggest that meaning is completely separate from the other components of story, such as language and plot and character. To do so would be pretty misleading for at least 3 reasons. Firstly, meaning can be created by precise control of language. Secondly, a work as a whole tends to treat at least one theme. Theme is a bearer of meaning. It is achieved through the overall arrangement of the story, i.e. the composition of language, plot, and character, and story world, and more. And we'll talk about theme in another episode. Finally, narrative is the arrangement of plot events into a form or structure that carries meaning. Narrative demonstrates causality. In between each plot event of a narrative, you could place the words, "because of that." Josephine went to the baker's. Because of that, she met Ben. If she had not, then she wouldn't have. If the cause of each scene is a preceding scene, and each scene determines how subsequent scenes are understood, then plot can be considered a motor of meaning. So meaning is like conflict in that it soaks through stories, filling a story up in an all-pervasive way. It is unlike conflict in that it is impossible to write a story which has no meaning at all, while it may, at least in theory, be possible to write a story which has no conflict. Authors are concerned with the deliberate and conscious composition of dramatic narrative. By arranging character actions, structuring plot, and determining theme, authors and storytellers convey meaning. Ultimately, though, meaning is in the mind of the beholder. Thanks for listening.